Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome to UEA London Lecture, and thank you very much for coming. It's quite a cold night out there, so it's great to see so many people here. My name's Cathy Carmichael, and I'm head of UEA's School of History. I'm delighted to see so many alumni, friends, and supporters here this evening. Welcome too to those of you considering a course at UEA. I hope this evening's discussion will inspire you. It's really nice to be here at Regent Street Cinema, a new venue for us, and very appropriate to be in this beautiful Victorian theatre, given the subject of tonight's lecture. In fact, this building is something of a historic landmark. We are reliably informed by our hosts that the theatre was home to the very first cinematic screening in the UK by the Lumiere brothers in 1896. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to make a small request of you. We'll be sending a brief survey via email on Monday to canvass your views on tonight's event. It would help us very much in planning future lectures if you could take the time to tell us what you think. For those of you on Twitter, please do tweet your thoughts about this evening's lecture using the hashtag UEA Live Lecture. Now I'd like to say a few words about our speaker for this evening. This is Dr. Tom Licence from the School of History. Tom took degrees at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and he was funded by the AHRC through his postgraduate studies, elected to a research fellowship at Magdalen in 2006, before being appointed to a lectureship in medieval history at UEA in 2009. He was promoted to senior lecturer in 2013. He's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Alongside his teaching work, Tom is also Director of the Centre for East Anglian Studies, which is based in the School of History. The centre was established at UEA in 1967 to develop and encourage the study of all aspects of the archaeology and history of Norfolk and Suffolk and the adjacent areas of Lincolnshire, Essex and Cambridgeshire, from prehistoric times to the present. Tom's lecture this evening will introduce a major research project which he has led since his arrival at UEA, called What the Victorians Threw Away. This project has rather excitingly seen the excavation of several Victorian rubbish sites around East Anglia, providing fascinating insight into how our ancestors lived, as well as valuable data about potential contamination from historical landfill. Now, those of you who'd like to look at the book, Tom will be signing copies of this later, so there's quite a few available for you here. Now, the project, which has been run by Tom and colleagues at the Centre for East Anglian Studies, What the Victorians Threw Away, has been a huge success, achieving its combined aims of enhancing local knowledge, providing for students, and forging links between regional researchers and the university. The project has already captured the public's imagination, having engaged up to 23.9 million people globally, online or in person, since its inception. In recognition of this achievement, Tom received a UEA award for outstanding contribution to public and community engagement in 2016. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Tom Licence to give tonight's lecture.
Well, thank you, Cathy, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Holly, for fixing the tea for me. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along this evening to hear about a load of old rubbish. And in case any of you fancy putting that in your feedback, it's been done before. Well, rubbish has always been with us. This is rubbish from 4,000 years ago, more or less, prehistoric rubbish. And it consisted of broken fragments of ceramic vessels, food waste in the form of typically oyster shells, and the prehistoric equivalent of industrial waste, flint flakes. If we move forward about 4,000 years to 1870, not much had really changed. The rubbish of 1870 consisted of broken ceramics, food waste, quite a few oyster shells, and some industrial waste too, in the form of slag there. One component I haven't mentioned, of course, was ashes and cinders from the hearth, which they had in prehistoric times, and which in Victorian times had become the vast bulk of rubbish discarded. Something like 90% by bulk of rubbish discarded in the 1870s was ash and dust from domestic coal fires. So what you see here is a tiny proportion. But note the fact that nothing much had changed for 4,000 years. This, on the other hand, is an assemblage of rubbish from the time of the First World War. And you'll see instantly that it looks very different. Quite a few items of packaging here, quite a few intact bottles for rose cold cream, Bovril, medicines, etc. Something remarkable had happened, a revolution in rubbish in the space of 40 years. Now, I wasn't the only one to notice this in 2009 when I embarked upon this project. You'll be pleased to know that in 1933, the Society for the Prevention of Disfigurement of Town and Country, what a wonderful society that was, became very concerned about these little piles of rubbish in rural areas. And they published a study concerning the disposal of domestic refuse. According to the society, which linked this problem to the increase in advertising, little piles of rubbish were spoiling the countryside, and they determined to do something about it. Their solution, obviously, was to distribute 4,000 questionnaires to women's institutes throughout the country, asking just how much tipping went on, because they thought the women's institutes would know about such things. About a quarter of these questionnaires came back, and 37% replied that there was no organised waste disposal in their area. That's 37% of rural districts in 1933 with no organised waste disposal. And often they explained that individual households made their own arrangements. Comments on the latter, and it's wonderful to read through some of these returns, included, I quote, "Thrown into a wood by the roadside or over the other fellow's hedge. Tins thrown into holes to help fill them up. And there are corners in nearly every lane where rubbish and old tins are thrown because too much trouble to take them to the tip." I love the way these comments are abbreviated. So my question today, of course, is where had all this rubbish come from? How had we gone in the space of 40 years from this, which is essentially prehistoric rubbish, to this, which is the modern rubbish that we are familiar with today? Well, 60 years earlier, going back to the 1870s, very little was thrown away. A popular manual from the time called Household Hints contained an entry on how to clean and repair bottles. Just like cups or bowls or jugs, bottles were regarded as reusable vessels, which were thrown away only when broken. And here is an example of some fragments I dug up from a late Victorian dump of reusable bottles, bottles which had been manufactured in the first half of the 19th century. These date from about 1820. And it had taken 80 years for them to be used again and again and again before they are eventually broken and discarded. Sometimes you can tell that they've been reused because they have patterns of wear on the base, as you might be able to see in this instance. So in the 1870s, we have to think of bottles as reusable vessels. Already, however, packaged products were beginning to appear on the market, appealing to ordinary people who increasingly had more disposable income. Ready-made products were desirable because they saved the labour of preparing substances at home. Take the entry on how to dye clothes in Household Hints, illustrating the point. So this is the entry from that book I mentioned from the 1870s, and it says this: Of old, this process was a very tedious and troublesome one, requiring special attention and appliances, together with a degree of chemical knowledge not common. But now, thanks to the introduction of Judson's dyes, it is neither a long, nor an expensive, nor a difficult task. Well, it reads almost like an advert, doesn't it? And you could just imagine Mr. Judson rubbing his hands with glee and sponsoring this entry. I should say that Household Hints sold millions of copies. It was a very popular manual. But the author was making the point that these products were labour-saving. Rather than having to go through the messy business of making dye at home with all sorts of dirty ingredients, you could buy it in a little glass bottle for a few pence. Well, Judson's, of course, introduced disposable glass packaging into a process where there had previously been none, and other companies did so at the same time. Bovril, registered in 1888, sold a popular beef extract for making beef tea. Now, previously, housewives, and it was usually housewives, had brewed up their own beef tea from offcuts of beef saved from the joint, boiled in a pan, a process which, of course, required no waste at all. Bovril made it a lot more convenient with its imported beef from the Argentine, but, of course, it introduced glass packaging into the process, what we might call disposable glassware. And as manufacturing techniques improved, along with transport networks, glass, ceramic, and metal packaging could be produced ever more cheaply and moved around the country. Surplus bottles, tins, and jars began piling up, particularly from the 1900s, when automatic bottling machines, that is, machines for making bottles automatically, were introduced. And all of a sudden, bottles could be manufactured in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds or thousands as they would be in a glass factory where they were made by hand. Previously, the Victorians had discarded things only when they were broken. Now, increasingly, they were discarding them because they were empty. And this is the key difference, throwing away something because it's no longer usable or discarding it because it's simply been emptied. And as the Society for the Prevention of Disfigurement of Town and Country discovered, by the 1930s, this throwaway culture was making an impact on the landscape. Now, in 2009, I thought it would be interesting to go around and dig up some of these rubbish dumps to see what they contained. Not only to tell the stories of individuals who leave often very intimate deposits in their back garden relating to their health and childhood and other matters, but also to see the origins and trajectory of this consumer society. These Waffle Bottles, for example, I excavated at Falkenham in Suffolk from a dump datable to 1908. Now, what I'd like to do for the lecture today is introduce you to 5 sites that we have excavated, including some of those I excavated for the book, which is here, and which is a good read, or, if you like pictures, has lots of coloured pictures, but also some of those we excavated as part of the community project at the University of East Anglia, involving students, school children, members of the general public. It's even been to Brazil and India. I'm going to move forward chronologically, starting from the 1870s, the time when you'll recall there's very little being thrown away, and I'm going to try to indicate at each stage what the new developments are so that you can see bit by bit how this revolution in waste unfolded. We'll end around about the 1920s, and hopefully I'll go on for no longer than 45 minutes, including the time I've spoken already. Site number 1 is Brachtish Rectory in Norfolk, here in a slightly fuzzy picture, apologies for that, where we discovered a couple of pits in the back of the property, way out tucked behind the stables at the rear, in a former sand pit, containing rubbish from the household of the 1870s. Now, I should say that this was an upper middle class household. The rector had a family of 6 or 8, including 2 servants, and an annual income of £350 a year. So these people had disposable income in the 1870s. Now, this is an assemblage of artefacts excavated from the pit by some students under my supervision. And you can see, I think, instantly that most of the rubbish here is broken material. We would we would class it as food waste and table waste, broken ceramics, broken glass. One or two intact bottles there. You'll just see that there's a medicine bottle and another small medicine bottle, but the vast bulk of material being thrown away at this rectory is still broken, still essentially prehistoric rubbish, we could call it. This then raises a very interesting question about the bottles which were not broken when they were thrown away. Here is the entire collection of bottles from the first trench which were not broken when they were discarded. Obviously, there might have been one or two more which were broken in the pit, and we can't be certain about those. But these bottles were an exceptional collection. And we can begin to answer questions about the decisions being made by the rector and his household as to what should be discarded intact. That is to say, what was surplus to requirements, what couldn't be refilled or returned to the proprietor or otherwise resold or reused. The brown earthenware bottles, there's half a dozen, well, maybe a dozen of those with the flared lips, look a bit like flower pots. Those are ceramic bottles for blacking, that is, for stove blacking and for harness blacking, which are made by companies such as Dalton in London, very cheaply, mass-produced at the potteries. And we find these turning up in early tips. This sort of bottle had been around since the 1810s, and it's quite clear that these are regarded as disposable. They are supernumerary, there are plenty of them, and of course, once you've finished emptying the blacking and rubbing it on the stove, you've got a very mucky bottle that's difficult to clean. So these are low-value items with no return value whatsoever. The two green bottles in the top corner here, they're an interesting case because they are bottles for German mineral water. Now, the rector was importing mineral water from Germany, and obviously, once it had been consumed, those bottles couldn't be sent back overseas, and the retailer had no interest in acquiring them again, so they were in this new category of disposable packaging, which is emerging in the 1870s. Ditto for the few medicine bottles there in the middle, plain medicine bottles, again, which are of little value to be returned. And interestingly also, the jam and marmalade pots down at the bottom. Now, this is where things become a little bit complicated, because I happen to know from one of the entries in the 1933 Women's Institute survey that at a certain rubbish dump in a wood, children were going in to scavenge the rubbish for wine bottles and jam pots. So, in some contexts, clearly, jam pots were regarded as reusable, and we know that in rural areas, people making jam would reuse these sorts of pots. Perhaps then it's simply the case that at a rectory where they have plenty of money to spend on jam and marmalade, regularly they're happy to discard a few of them, and a few of them will end up in the rubbish. Or perhaps these were ones which weren't scavenged. Bottom corner here, two champagne bottles. Imported from France under pressure. Once the contents had been drunk, of course, they couldn't be returned to France, so they are going into the waste. And what we're seeing, therefore, are categories of low-value bulk commodities, imports where the bottles couldn't be returned, and perhaps supernumerary containers, which in other contexts might be scavenged. Just to illustrate some of those imports, because some of the work we've been doing more recently on waste has been pointing to the global trade networks, which are already beginning to emerge in middle-class rural households at this time. So the rector wasn't particularly content to drink fizzy water from Buxton or from other spa towns. He had to have the best imported, and that included Uppel's mineral waters from Friedrichshain, and of course seltzers from Niederseltzers, which gives us the word seltzer. These bottles were imported all through the 19th century and beyond, up to the First World War, and of course French mustard, the very best imports. All of the broken or intact containers finding their way into the rector's rubbish dump, unreturnable. Let's move forward now to our second case study in the mid-1890s. This is Hempstead Rectory in Norfolk. We're sticking with the same social class here, but moving about 20, 25 years forward in time. Now, I was invited along with Ben to go and excavate this site in 2012 because the owner, who happened to be the father and mother of the curator of the Castle Museum in Norwich, the archaeology section, sort of invited me over and said they'd been finding some archaeology in their flower bed. Not the usual sort of archaeology, more like broken bits of plate. And it turned out that there was a little pit in the corner up by the outdoor privy. Now, this is the privy. This jutting out wall here is a brick-lined privy which had been decommissioned in the late Victorian times. And what we began to discover when we scraped away the topsoil and carefully removed the bulbs was the outline of a brick-lined pit. And you can just see the square outline there with some of the broken crockery emerging from it. And as we troweled away layer by layer, it soon became obvious that this pit had been decommissioned and filled to the brim with rather sessy Victorian rubbish. Just a sample shot of some of it being put to the side while under excavation. So we had an assemblage, and we were soon able to date it around about 1895 to a particular household that moved in at that time, the Kendall family. And we know a few details about the Reverend Kendall and his wife Julia and their children, whose rubbish we also found. Now, already it was becoming obvious with Hempstead that a lot more bottles and waste packaging items were being discarded by this particular rector, at least, in the 1890s. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the categories, not only to show what is becoming disposable, but also to give you insights into their diet and their health concerns. So the egg-shaped bottles, up over this side, they contained soda water or mineral water, which would be mixed with wine to make spritzers for garden parties, typically. They're all from the firm of Cayley in Norwich, with one exception, which was from Stewart and Patterson of Norwich, when they were still Stewart, Patterson and Finch before 1895. And they'd been imported about an hour's drive nowadays from Norwich to Hempstead Rectory, possibly for one of the garden parties which we know the rector held. Why are they egg-shaped, you might ask? It's a question I'm often asked. It goes back to the basic problem that the Victorians had with fizzy drinks, which is that if you stored the drink in a bottle upright and stuck a cork in it, the cork would soon dry out, as corks do, and the gas would escape, causing the drink to go flat. If, on the other hand, you lay the bottle on its side, then the contents would keep the cork moist and it wouldn't shrink, and therefore the drink could remain fizzy. And so a man called William Hamilton in 1814 came up with the enterprising invention of a bottle which had to be stored on its side in order to keep the drink fizzy, the Hamilton bottle. And we find them in late Victorian dumps regularly. Here they are finding their way into the rubbish. But here are some other items too. The two green bottles down at the bottom are for French olives. They would have been imported with the olives in them and obviously were not returnable. And we're beginning to see containers for ink, these flared lip, I should use my pointer, shouldn't I? These flared lip stoneware containers, again mass-produced in the potteries of London, turning up in the rubbish here. Medicine bottles of various sorts down there. Bottles for fruit juice concentrate, like a fruit juice powder that you'd mix with water. I'll come to them in a future slide. And also other little ink bottles and small disposable packaging bottles, which are now being considered as rubbish and, of course, proliferating, because between the 1870s and the 1890s, many, many more of these products, including Judson's dyes and Bovril, come onto the market. There's also a random honey pot there, which perhaps in a different context would have been salvaged. Now, we also have to look at the tableware to get an indication of consumption and waste and the evolution of the throwaway society. The rectors could afford to import hand-painted tableware. In this case, it's a fine plate, hand-painted, from China. And we also find some gold leaf decorated, hand-painted tableware here, as you can see, and some porcelain imported from Limoges. So these are very high-quality items of tableware, which seem to have been discarded only when broken. There was no indication that any of these had been thrown away intact. They'd simply been dropped in the usual knockabout of the kitchen and life in the Victorian household. We also found some children's items which probably belonged to the Kendall's little girl, Eva. This is a child's bone toothpaste, toothbrush, a new category of waste, particularly associated with the upper classes who use toothbrushes. The poor often wouldn't bother, or they would use a rag and a bit of soot to clean their teeth. A fancy bisque doll's head, very high quality doll here, obviously the casualty of too much rough and tumble in the nursery. A tile from the nursery made by Wedgwood. This is from a series called The Months, and there was a tile for every month, this one for January, showing two girls playing. But I also want to draw your attention to this broken plate up here, which is a doll's plate, just to point out that even the dolls had gold leaf hand-painted tableware in this rectory. Now, this is important because later on I'll show you what the rubbish of a labourer's cottage looks like, and it's rather different. Now, there were a few mysteries beginning to emerge in this rubbish. I am an old-fashioned detective sort of historian, and I like to get my teeth into a good puzzle. And one such puzzle was the appearance of, I think, 7, I don't know whether they're all there in that photograph, but 7 plates made by the brothers Thomas and Benjamin Godwin of Burslem, one of the pottery towns in Staffordshire, between 1809 and 1834. So there's a whole set of plates made by this company in a pattern called Genovese. Each pattern has its name, which were at least 60 years old when they went into this pit in 1895. And I began to wonder, well, is this the case of the maid dropping a whole trayload of plates at once, or are they having a clear-out? We know that the family had moved into the rectory in that year, and it might be that when they got there they found lots of old plates obligingly left behind in the cupboards and thought, we don't want those, we've got our own nice gold leaf tableware, let's chuck them in the pit. Well, this hypothesis found some sort of confirmation when I also discovered 7 Coalport Cups. One of them is missing from this photograph. These are cups for coffee or cocoa. You can see the crown for Coalport there on the bottom. And that crown, that pottery mark, was used between 1881 and 1889. So these are probably about 10 years old when discarded. And again, I rather think it's more likely that they were thrown away in a clear-out than that 7 cups were dropped at once or at one sitting. In case we want confirmation of this, this is a rather finely turned wine jug. I say wine jug because it's got grapes and other evidence of bacchanalian revels on the top of it. Now, as you can see, this jug could have been repaired, and indeed has been repaired very well. It came up in 2 pieces. Household hints from the 1870s offered advice on how to repair jugs and bottles, as I mentioned. But the rector and his family, and indeed his servants, had thought better of repairing it and had simply slung it into the rubbish. So what we're beginning to see in the 1890s in an upper middle class family is not only the propensity to throw away more and more packaging and to see bottles as packaging and as waste, but also to upgrade their tableware and discard anything that might be flawed. Habits, of course, that we are very familiar with today. Now, because I've just come back from lecturing the communists in Kerala on the throwaway society, which was lots of fun, I thought I'd introduce you to an Indian commodity which is also finding its way into the diet of late Victorian rectors, for example. This is Frank Newbery's Exeter Bombay relish. Interesting mixed messages there, not quite clear whether it's coming from Exeter or from Bombay, but for 6pence you could purchase Frank Newbery's Exeter Bombay relish, just giving you an indication not only of how goods are travelling and ending up in the diet and in the dustbin of Victorian rectors, but also how spicy foods are beginning to enter the diet. A chap called Derek Oddie wrote a very interesting book called From Plain Fare to Fusion Food, describing how the Brits in the 19th century went from a diet of potatoes and bread and rice and tea and jam to a diet of sauces and spices and Indian stuff. And this is an indication of that. Another foreign import, this is a bottle from Carlsbad, a modern-day Karlovy Vary in the Czech Republic, which contains sprudel salts. And sprudel salts, as the advert shows, is an excellent aperient, laxative and diuretic for constipation, rheumatism, gout, diabetes, liver and kidney troubles, or all of them on a bad day. Sprudel salts would do the trick. And this is obviously for our rector with his spicy diet, sitting at his desk, writing his letters all the time. Now, there were similar products available on the English market. There's one called cut-nose powders, which is a rather cheap knockoff, claiming to be the evaporated salts of various European spa towns. Carlsbad Sprudel salts was the real McCoy, and it said on the advert that if the sealed label had been messed around with, then you shouldn't touch it. So this is the proper stuff. And the rector made sure that he imported the best stuff from Carlsbad. Local produce too, finding its way into the rectory. Blanche Flour had a factory in Great Yarmouth, but also a factory in Norwich, and they made all sorts of potted meats. Fish paste with the famous Yarmouth herrings was one of the favourites, but also ham and chicken. And these jars don't turn up very often because they were meant to be returnable. One indication of that is the fact that this has been left blank so that the label could be changed each time it's washed out and refilled with a new type of homemade something or other. So one occasion it might be homemade fish paste, another occasion it might be homemade chicken and ham. Obviously, Mr. Blanchflower had invested capital in his containers, but it was a long way to take them back to Yarmouth, so they ended up in the rubbish. Now, I mentioned earlier these little bottles for fruit juice concentrate. It was a sort of powder or crystalline thing, and you'd pour it into a vat of water. And every one of these bottles, according to an advert from the year 1899, made 4.5 gallons of fruit juice. So that's a lot of fruit juice represented in these four alone. Now, in the rubbish pit, we found 21 of these bottles, all in one corner, as though there had been a mass binge on fruit juice on one occasion at the Rectory. And that's quite possible because a newspaper from 1896 revealed that Kendall and his family had a garden party with a brass band and presumably lots of children and villagers coming along. And so maybe all of these were being tipped into a vast vat of fruit juice so the kids could go up and get their E numbers. Anyway, the interesting thing about these bottles, for me at least, because I'm a nerd on these things, was that 18 out of 21 of them were from a local firm, De Carl and Son of Magdalen Street in Norwich. 3 of them, however, were from what we might call emerging brands. 2 of them from the Eiffel Tower Fruit Juice Company based at Maidstone in Kent, which marketed itself after the erection of the Eiffel Tower, obviously, on that Eiffel Tower and the associations of play and leisure. And the other one was from the Big Wheel Fruit Juice Company in Bristol, which also took the big wheel at Bristol Fairground, sort of symbolising that these things were for picnics and for outings and for fun. And these 3 brands were creeping in 1895. Now, we found some cups from a caterer called John Pike, who was probably supplying the drinks for the garden parties. And I like to think that these 21 bottles are a representative sample of what might have been on his shelves or in the shop, for example, in Norwich, in terms of fruit juice. So you've got mostly local, but the brands, the universal brands, just creeping in. Now, talking about local brands and beverages, here are some of the bottles that we recovered from the King's Lynn Town rubbish dump, for which we did a feature on BBC Inside Out that was screened in October 2015. As you can see at the top, there were a very large number of ginger beer bottles, all of which were in theory returnable because they bore the names of the different proprietors, either incised or printed under the glaze, and many of these proprietors were still going when the bottles were discarded. And we also know that the site was scavenged, so these seem to be bottles that have made it through and not been picked up and returned. Likewise, we have lots of fizzy drinks bottles down here from the 1880s and 1890s, and these ones are the type with a marble in it. Now, some of you might have come across the bottles with the marbles in, and I know certainly 1 or 2 of you know why they had marbles in. Those round-shaped bottles for fizzy drinks, after a while, became a bit annoying, as you might imagine. And so in 1875, a wonderful chap with a Victorian name, Mr. Hiram Cod, invented what we call the Cod Bottle, which was a bottle with a marble in the neck. Now, the marble started off as a stopper wedged in the neck under pressure because the bottles were filled upside down. And in order to open the bottle, you had to have something like a wooden mushroom to push the marble down inside, which would then get trapped in the lug in the neck so that you could pour the fizzy drink out without it getting in the way. Now, if you go to the Japan Centre in London, or indeed many Japanese restaurants, you'll find that in Japan they still serve cream soda in these bottles, and they call it an ancient Japanese tradition. But it was invented by Hiram Cod in 1875. Anyway, what you'll see from these bottles again, from 1880 to 1900, is that the vast majority of fizzy drinks and bottled drinks were produced by local purveyors. We've got something like 10 or 12 different firms here, mostly from King's Lynn, such as Parker of King's Lynn and William Ramsell's there somewhere, but also some Norwich firms such as Cayley and Morgan's of Norwich, with a branch store in King's Lynn, and Stewart and Patterson, etc. So mineral waters, fizzy drinks, obviously low-value comestibles are being sourced and produced locally, and there's a large market for them associated with the temperance movement. Fancy mineral waters are being imported. Moving on now to our third case study. This is a shot of the back of a row of labourers' cottages at Gustin in Kent, the first site we dug in 2009. Now, these people were so poor that in 1947, they were sharing a bucket for a toilet. When I say sharing, there are 4 households here, and they had a privy at the back with a bucket in. That was their sanitation arrangement. We don't know their names because the census from 1891, 1901 doesn't give us house numbers to match to the names of people living in that lane, but it's almost certain that these were agricultural labourers. And when we were invited there in 2009 to dig up some rubbish at the back of the garden, find the rubbish pits, we found a chalk ridge with a series of pits that had been dug into it for the extraction of chalk to make whitewash or lime mortar or something else, and they had been backfilled with rubbish. We found one from the 1880s, one from the 1900s, and one from about the end of the First World War, circa 1918. Now, here is an assemblage of broken crockery from one of those pits from the 1880s, 1890s. And I want you to remember what I was telling you about the crockery at the Rectory at Hempstead, because what you see in front of you is almost all transfer printed, cheaply manufactured crockery of the sort that you can find anywhere. You go into your back garden and have a dig, and you'll probably find a piece of this blue and white willow pattern. And the reason there's so much of it is that it was dirt cheap to manufacture, and it was the one pattern which all the potters agreed they would share and manufacture. All the other patterns and designs were patented. So we find willow pattern all over the place in the rubbish of the poor. We also sometimes find mockerware. Now, there's still a chap who makes mockerware, a chap called Roger Irving at Boscastle in Cornwall. He's been potting there for over 50 years. We went visited him a few years ago and got some samples. He's the only person who still knows how to make mockerware, which has this seaweedy trailing design on it. And that was, again, very cheaply produced and is often found in the rubbish of public houses, as well as the poor. And we have some other cheap transfer printed ceramics, so rubbishy ceramics. Bottles from 1900 in a poor household. Now, this is an interesting insight into what those at the bottom of society were consuming and discarding. Now, we don't know anything about these people from the records. We often don't. There aren't records for the majority of lives lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But we can learn a lot about people from what they throw away. So, for example, we learn that they were literate because they had ink bottles. Not all labourers were able to write. We also learn that they had children because these little bottles here were for Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Now, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, I know it sounds wonderful and charming and delightful. This was what Victorian mothers, or irresponsible Victorian mothers, if you believe the author of Household Hints, gave to their babies to shut them up when they were teething. And the reason they were irresponsible, according to the author of Household Hints, back in the 1870s, was that these contained morphine. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrups was nicknamed the baby killer. And occasionally, unfortunately, it had that effect. And this was known about in the 1870s, at least, among the middle classes. But this product's still being used in the 1900s. There we have some of those Eiffel Tower fruit juice bottles, a national brand turning up everywhere by the 1900s, and other national brands are beginning to creep in, like Bishop's Citrate for Magnesia, milk of magnesia for stomach upsets, a bottle we find all over the place. Eno's fruit salts, another fizzy preparation for stomach upsets that we find everywhere. Poison bottle down here too, probably for killing vermin. They are usually blue and hexagonal and ribbed, and the reason for that is so that they weren't confused with medical bottles in medicine cabinets and in the dark when people were fumbling around by candlelight. So again, the design there reflecting the use of the bottle. Now, a couple of luxuries creep into the rubbish here. If you read the budget models put together by late Victorian social reformers, you get this impression that the poor are thrifty and hard-working and will only ever consume potatoes and jam and bread and only what is within their budget. Well, actually, we have a pot of rose cold cream there for 1 shilling, which would have been quite a luxury for this household, possibly a birthday present, who knows, and a little perfume bottle. And we just begin to get an insight into these people who aren't quite the model peasants that they're made out to be by the Victorian social reformers. Rubbish doesn't lie, this is what they threw away. Just a single blacking bottle there in the top left, probably for boot blacking. There aren't hordes of servants here getting through blacking bottles left, right and centre like there were at Brach. Now, some of my favourite artefacts from the rubbish are the children's artefacts. And if you go onto our website, whatthevictoriansthrew.away.com or wtvta.com, you will see that there's a whole section on childhood. Now, as I said, we don't know anything about the labourers in this cottage, but we do know that they encouraged their children to learn to read and write at a very early age by surrounding them with objects, there's a culture, material culture of learning. Alphabet cups, something we still have today, but also nursery rhyme cups. And these two have verses in different colours from This Is the House That Jack Built. So as you might be able to see there, this is the house that Jack built. This is the dog that chased the cat, that killed the rat, that ate the malt, that lived in the house. Thank you. Oh, that's the very dog there, in green. Over there, we have the cock that crowed in the morn that waked the priest all shaven and shorn. And we have a depiction of the priest and a depiction of the cock. Now, these two cups are from the 1840s. They're pearlware. That little blue tinge in the bottom is pearlware, and they ceased producing that in the Staffordshire potteries by the 1850s. So these were already 40 or 50 years old when they were discarded. Were they a hand-me-down from Grandma? Were they purchased second-hand from a peddler or given as a gift? I don't have the answer to those questions, but I can tell you what nursery rhymes those children learnt in those cottages by excavating their rubbish. There's a little cup with the word wren on it and a bird above it, which is probably a wren. And that fits in with Victorian educational philosophies about object lessons, because young children would go to school and every day they would have a penny or a cart or a horse, and they'd have to tell a story and learn all about that object, and a wren might be among them. And there we have a toy cockerel and another toy cockerel. Perhaps birds familiar from the farmyard. There's a little girl's thimble. So we can imagine perhaps a little girl doing sampler embroidery, etc., etc. So rubbish doesn't only tell us about consumption, it tells us about the material culture of childhood and what childhood meant in a context where it's usually invisible. Moving on to our fourth case study. This is the post office which was shared between Marshbrook and Acton Scott in Shropshire in circa 1910. I'm just going to have a drink of elderflower cordial from my disposable glassware bottle. Did anyone watch Victorian Farm and Edwardian Farm and Victorian Pharmacy as well? Nice pun there. I was very fond of Victorian Farm. For those of you who didn't see it, it came out about probably 10 years ago now, 8 or 10 years ago, and it involved a team of archaeologists and historical reenactors going to Acton Scott in Shropshire and redoing a derelict cottage that had been abandoned since the 1950s and living there the life of Victorian farming household. Wonderful programme. Anyway, this is the site, Acton Scott, and we happened to be there one New Year with friends going past this bank, and we spotted some rubbish poking out of the side of the bank, the hillside there, washed away by the rain, and so we started rummaging around. And I got permission from Rupert Acton to go and dig there, just on the edge of his estate, and I soon started discovering assemblages that looked a bit like this. Now, troweling away into the slope there, it soon became apparent that bucket loads of rubbish had been deposited. What you can see here is the base of a bucket, and I've peeled away the rusted body of the bucket to expose the contents, which include one beer bottle, one saucer broken, one pudding bowl for steamed puddings broken, a rusted tin inside it, and then up there, outside the bucket, there's another beer bottle and the bottom of cut-nose powders, which I mentioned earlier, that cheap knockoff substitute for Carlsbad sprudel salts. And what I began to find with this rubbish, here's another example of a bucket. There's a bottle of furniture cream, Eno's fruit salts, another beer from Shrewsbury, and a mineral water. What I began to find were these time capsules, little time capsules, one bucket at a time, like a week's worth of rubbish. Now, just to explain, this post office circa 1910, when the rubbish was discarded, was in the hands of a man called Mr. Phillips, and here was his pigsty. Just behind it was a hedge, and on that hedge, the bank rises up very steeply, and that is the boundary of the Acton Scott's estate, the lord of the manor. That's the very edge of their estate. So what Mr. Phillips was doing was he was going over to feed his pigs with a swill and his vegetable waste and other things like that, and chucking the hardcore over the hedge onto Lord Acton's estate. What was that bit from the Women's Institute? Over the other fellow's hedge? Well, of course, in time, this pigsty became a bicycle shed for the postman and then eventually was demolished. And the demolition of that caused the bank to erode and the hedge to be washed away, hence the exposure of this rubbish. So we're moving now into the 1910s. We're going to ask the question, what did the postman throw away? Well, in case you're wondering what postmen threw away in the 1910s, they threw away lots of beer bottles, and they threw away lots of ink bottles, and lots of furniture polish bottles. So perhaps there aren't any surprises there. Mr. Phillips would have had lots of wooden surfaces at the counter. He would have polished regularly. He would have got through lots of ink, and he apparently drank lots of beer. But let's go into it in a little bit more detail. All these bottles, with the exception of this one, which has somehow come over from Burton-on-Trent, and there are a lot more of these bottles, they were all from firms in Shrewsbury, which is only about a 15-minute drive, 20-minute drive today from Acton Scott. So these were returnable bottles. The names were on them, and even in 1910, you could probably get a deposit for these bottles. So Mr. Phillips was throwing away what were probably surplus bottles, and it wasn't worth his while to make the journey into Shrewsbury to return them to those shops. Here we begin to see the economies of waste. If you lived in Shrewsbury, you'd be more likely to walk down the road and return them. If you're out in the countryside, it's more likely that you're going to chuck it away. So being isolated increases the likelihood that you will become a member of a throwaway society. Stevenson's furniture cream, previously sold in stoneware, now sold in cheaper glass, was another commodity, obviously, that the postman got through in large quantities, just as those servants got through the blacking in the 1870s at Brockdish. So we're beginning to see categories of disposable item very clearly, ditto with the inks. Now, moving on to the 1910s, and this brings us to the 1910s assemblage from Gustin, which I showed you at the beginning of this lecture. Gustin, you'll remember, was that set of labourers' cottages where there were a series of pits dug into the chalk along the back of the garden and filled with rubbish. And my favourite pit was this one. which was filled sometime between 1915 and 1918, during the First World War and up to the end of it. I'm going to draw your attention to some interesting things. First of all, down at the bottom are about 35 Bovril bottles, which were 35 of the 50 or 60 that came out of that pit in total. So Bovril as a brand has taken off by the 1910s. You remember that Bovril came out in 1888 and was marketed against beef tea. It was marketed, in fact, as the substance of the beef, not the shadow. That was an attack upon beef tea made at home. During the First World War, Bovril, which was imported from Argentina, kept its price the same when the price of most other imports, and also of meat, which is usually given to the troops, rocketed. So if you wanted something hot and nourishing in your farmyard in the 1910s during the war, you would perhaps rely on Bovril. And you can just see here how that brand is taking off. In 1912, the famous Bovril airship was flown over London. And on one side it said, "Give him Bovril," and on the other side it said, "Give her Bovril." So couples who were shopping in different sides of London might have made similar purchase decisions. When the Bovril airship was flown, sales of Bovril rocketed from something like 250,000 to 1.5 million almost overnight. And in the next year, 1913, the Bovril company invested in automated bottling machines, which meant that these bottles no longer had to be made by hand, but could be manufactured in a machine. And in case you're wondering how you tell the difference, a bottle made in an automatic bottling machine will have a seam, a mould seam, that runs all the way through the lip of the top of the bottle, because it's all made in one mould, whereas in the glass factory, the lip would be applied by hand. It wouldn't have a seam through it. So mass production, mass advertising had created a brand almost in the space of a decade. These are little milk glass pots for Pond's cold cream, face cream, and sort of similar creams. These too had become a very popular brand in the 1910s for health and beauty. And then we see other brands creeping in. Woodward's Chemist of Nottingham, almost ubiquitous by the 1910s. We find these bottles everywhere. Boots the Chemist too. Boots is creeping in, supplanting local pharmaceuticals. Local chemists, I should say. One or two other brands and a couple of jam pots here. And drinks bottles, whiskey and other things. Despite Lloyd George's fulminations against spirits, they're appearing in the rubbish. So this assemblage obviously has a lot more packaging in it, a lot more brands than we see in earlier assemblages, and is in bulk is far, far greater. By the time we get to the 1910s, ash, domestic ash and dust from coal fires is no longer 90%. It's about 80% by weight of the rubbish. And the bulk of broken or intact glass and tin and ceramic has increased almost 200%. Well, we'll finish off with a couple of insights into some of the work we've been doing. This society is becoming very wasteful. You know, people say that between the wars we were very thrifty. I've even read an academic article or two about how people were very thrifty between the wars. Indeed, in the First and Second World War. That's not true. I mean, some people were thrifty, others weren't. This is rubbish from the village rubbish dump at Ringstead, near Hunstanton. Look at all those marmalade and jam pots, which would have been scavenged elsewhere, and all these ginger beer bottles, which could have been taken back. And look at all that scrap copper. It's quite a lot of money's worth of scrap copper there. These people were thrifty. This is rubbish from the farmhouse at Falkenham, a very, very poor farmhouse, just after the lady of the house died in 1908. Just to give you an insight into what it looks like when we train students or get them to do our labour for us, we come down onto a layer of what is basically ash. That black stuff down there, as Phil from Time Team would put it, that black stuff, that is ash. And in that ash is all the rubbish we've been excavating. This is capping, clay capping. And we wouldn't have known about the existence of this rubbish dump had it not started to wash through the side of the farm pond there, meriting an excavation. And as you see, we've been getting students involved and training them in archaeology. This is a shot of the community dig that we did in Dis in 2015, March 2015. We found all sorts of interesting things, including the only fresh examples of Anglo-Saxon pottery from Dis, establishing a presence of an Anglo-Saxon settlement there. But on that occasion, we were training up children from Diss High School who were thrilled to be finding bits of Victorian rubbish and tobacco pipes and the odd spectacle lens and other odd things. This is my colleague Lawrence showing them how to sieve and trowel. He's from the Waveney Valley branch of the Young Archaeologists Club. And many of these children decided, I think four or five certainly, to join the club afterwards. And finally, here we are at Curtin in Suffolk, not far from Falkenham, with a group of the villagers coming to watch us excavate the Rectory rubbish dump there. And in case you were wondering what was in the Rectory rubbish dump from about 1908 at Curtin, plenty and plenty of furniture cream bottles. These are what they looked like before Stevenson switched to glass, and obviously the servants at that particular rectory didn't have quite as much fun as the servants at Downton Abbey. They spent their entire life polishing furniture. Well, if you'd like to know more, then there is a book with 90 colour illustrations, the proceeds of which go to the Centre of East Anglian Studies, which is 50 years old this year. There is also a wonderful website and database showing thousands of objects which we have excavated, and it's searchable by terms such as marble, or bottle, or ginger beer, or doll's leg, or anything you like, and you can search for words and you can find the item and the context in which it was found. We've also got a Twitter feed, hashtag VixDustbin, and I would encourage you, if you want to know more, to go to those places. Thanks very much for listening, and I think I will now take some questions, or maybe Kathy will do that for me.
Yeah, no, I've done it. We've got some time for questions now, so if you've got questions you want to ask, please
Hello? Yes.
Yes, I can hear you, yes. I was just looking at my slides, so I was going to go back and find a metal thing.
Is that because metal was routinely recycled because it had a clear monetary value?
You raise a very important point, and it's a point I should have made, which is that many things don't survive in the ground. Organic matter obviously doesn't survive in the ground, and metal typically doesn't. You might find the odd tin after 80 years, but by about 100 years it rusts away. Often the deposits I excavate are very orange, and that signals the presence of lots and lots of tins. And quite a few tins were being discarded. So if you look here, I'll point out a couple. There's a tin for Brasso. There's a tin there. There's another rusted tin there. Another rusted tin there. A flat tin there. So occasionally they come out, and you can also just see that these cold cream bottles still have rusted metal caps on. So it is there, and I should have made that point, but mostly it rusts away, and you're very lucky if you can come across an example where you can still see the lettering on the tin. There are a couple in the book where I was just able to make out what the contents were, but usually they rust away. But they were being thrown away too. It wasn't just the glass. The tins and cans were being discarded. Yeah.
Not copper and brass are too valuable to dispose of. Is that the case?
Well, the villagers at Ringstead didn't think so. We've got a copper kettle. We've actually got two copper kettles, a copper vase, copper wire, copper pans. Some households would have recognised the value of this. Others seem to have chucked it away. Gentleman there at the top, in the white.
Thank you. I'd be rather concerned about toxicity from things like paint. I think William Morris dug up an enormous amount of arsenic. I'd be very concerned about rummaging through Victorian waste for that reason. Did you take any precautions?
Yes. Every dig we do has a full risk assessment, and in the dig at Diss, because there were concerns over high levels of mercury pollution in the mere, all of our students had mercury safety masks. I've got some photographs of us doing the dig at Ringstead where you'll see we're actually wearing masks because of possible contaminants. But I think with most of these digs, it's just a case of being careful and keeping a lookout for things like, as you say, old paint. I mean, this was a bit of a scandal in Victorian times because William Morris had this wonderful green colour of wallpaper. And he also owned arsenic mines, and he was using the arsenic to make it green. And of course, people were falling sick and dying, and the medical profession were beginning to draw the connection. And William Morris was writing in saying, no, there's no obvious connection. There are contaminants in old rubbish dumps. One of the things we've been doing with the project is liaising with local council officials to sample some of these rubbish dumps to establish whether they pose a risk to human and animal and sort of wildlife health. So we have been working with the contaminated land officers on that. So we are very aware of that, yes, thank you. Oh, lady down here at the front.
I don't really know how to phrase this question, but basically, when I think about how much rubbish I have every day, it is much more than what's being found in these pits. So, over what time period is the rubbish? I appreciate that it might be different for different places, but any kind of indication?
That's a very important question. The answer is I don't know. What I can do is guess. So I think the rubbish assemblage from the second rectory from the 1890s when it was all in that brick-lined pit, I think that was all deposited between 1895 and 1896. And I make these estimations on the basis of rapidly changing bottle designs, the manufacturers which are and which aren't represented there, and the pottery marks. So that looked like it was a clearance assemblage for when they moved into the rectory and cleared out a whole load of other stuff and chucked away their everyday rubbish at the same time. The buckets, they might be 1 or 2 weeks worth, that's my guess. But it's really hard to know. And I suspect that quite a lot of bottles, ginger beer bottles, for example, and jam jars are being reused. And these are often just surplus ones. The rubbish we have today, of course, includes plastics. We begin to find plastics in rubbish dumps from the very end of the 1950s. And from the 1980s, 1990s, we begin to get white goods, old refrigerators, and also e-waste. And so we have whole different categories of rubbish today, which we might create. But we also create a lot of packaging which they wouldn't have dreamed about. I mean, if you go into Marks and Spencer, you can buy a salad portion in a plastic box, or an individual muffin in a plastic muffin pod, or little bits of cutlery in plastic wrapping. I mean, they didn't have packaging that was quite as wasteful and ridiculous as that. So we do generate a lot more, and it is very hard to tell how what this represents, really. It's a good methodological question, I should say.
Hi, Tom. You in the Kent labourers' cottages, the pit from about 1900. I noticed there was one stem, but one head of a clay pipe.
Yes.
I just wondered, is that just indicative? Were there very few by 1900? Had smoking habits changed to cigarettes by that point?
Yes, absolutely. If you dig a rubbish dump from the 1870s, 1880s, you'll find lots of clay pipes. By 1900, cigarettes and cigars are superseding them. So you will find them occasionally, but they're much, much rarer. It's always possible that this was a random clay pipe that was used for blowing bubbles by the children, of course, and they did use them for that purpose. But they are going out of fashion, and you start to find tins of cigarettes turning up in the 1900s and 1910s. So certainly, the 1890s is the decade when the cigarette takes over from the clay pipe, and that is absolutely reflected in the rubbish. Lady down here?
I'm wondering what you do with the rubbish that you dig up. You have a museum full of millions of bottles of Bovril and...
Well, a few items were requested by the Pitt Rivers Museum and have gone on, are soon to be going on show in a new exhibit they have on the top floor of the Pitt Rivers on sort of different designs and shapes of things that have been thrown away. Most of it stays with the landowners. Once it's been recorded, catalogued, photographed, put on the database, most of it stays with the landowners. Some of it gets put back in the ground. Most of these items aren't rare and exceptional or archaeological artefacts. And indeed, rubbish dumps are not classed as archaeological sites. They're in this weird limbo. So these are classed, these sites we dig up, as historic landfill. And if the council becomes aware of them, for example, in advance of a building project, they will send in a team with diggers, and they will dig it all out and take it to a modern landfill site. So these sites aren't considered to be special or protected. And one of the things we've been doing is what we might call rescue work on sites which are soon to be developed, mining the archives as best we can and publishing it in the way we've done with the database. But yes, I mean, most of this is with the landowners or back in the ground.
We have time for one more question. Is somebody at the back there?
There's a lady up there.
Hi. First of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture and thought-provoking. Two things. Do you, in your experience, do you think that most older properties had these landfill sites, the little dumps around especially in East Anglia? And if so, how would you recognise it? If you happen to live on an old, Tudor property, how would you recognise it?
Another great question. Yes. In rural areas, everyone had to make their own arrangements for rubbish disposal. And that was also true in urban areas up until the Public Health Acts of the 1850s and 1870s, where cesspits were often used or rubbish was tipped on the boundaries of properties or in the Thames, for example. In rural areas, pretty much every household, every isolated household, will have usually more than one rubbish pit, and sometimes rows of cottages will share them. How to find them? You have to use a bit of detective work. So you have to think that people are carrying bulky rubbish, usually out the back of the house from the kitchen. They don't necessarily want to struggle very far with it. So you'll be looking for some out-of-the-way place behind trees, perhaps, or an old pond that's now no longer in use, or an old clay-digging pit or a chalk pit, or some other hole that can be filled in the ground. They're very clean and tidy usually, so there aren't often remains visible unless they've been disturbed by tree roots or by burrowing animals or by ditching work or whatever. So you might be looking for a mound, or if you're looking on old maps, you might see, for example, that in the 1881 Ordnance Survey map there's still a ditch, and in 1891 that ditch has vanished. Or there's a pond in one map which is half gone in the other. One site we dug at Holme Hale Hall was in an old saw pit. And the saw pit was there by the old sawmill in 1911, and it had gone in 1925, and we found that it had been filled with rubbish in about 1923. So clues on the landscape, clues in maps, using a bit of common sense, and we also probe. So I've got a probe, stick it down into the ground, pull it up, look at the soil core, and if you get that black stuff, which I was showing you, then you know you're onto something. But this one, just to go back to your point. This one was exposed purely by chance, as I said, when half the bank of the pond fell away and some bottles started poking out. And the same was true with that one at Acton Scott, where the bank was being washed away and bottles were poking out. So they can be very difficult to detect. But, for example, nettles and alders will often grow in old rubbish dumps because they thrive on soil rich in phosphates. And so the vegetation can sometimes give clues, even when there are no other signs. A patch of nettles in the middle of a field might suggest the presence of a pit.
Thank you.
Super. It falls to me to give the vote of thanks for a wonderful lecture tonight, Tom. Next time I take Carlsbad Sprudel salts, I'll know all about where it comes from. Please join us as well for a drink. It would be lovely to talk to you in the foyer. Thanks very much, Tom. It was wonderful.